Welcome to Overnight Wisdom, a show where we sit with changemakers, artists, business leaders, and thinkers. Each conversation is an invitation to slow down, to go deeper, and unearth the quiet insights that shape who we are. If you're seeking honest reflections, unexpected wisdom, and a deeper understanding of what it takes to not merely survive, but to thrive, you're in the right place. Today, we meet a man who refuses to outsource Africa's future. DJ Bwakali is a writer, organizer, and unapologetic Pan-Africanist who believes sovereignty isn't a slogan. It's food on the table, borders that don't block Africans from Africa, and classrooms that teach our children who they were before the world told them who to be. He's done the lobbying, now he's building. Youth movements, citizens media, and trade routes that carry ideas across the continent. DJ says the first revolution is on our plates. Reclaim indigenous crops, ditch toxic inputs, and make hunger unthinkable on a land and continent that holds most of the world's arable soil. He gives today's leaders an F, that's a fail, then flips the mirror back to us. Sovereign power sits with the people who show up. And ask yourself, what is my role in this work? How am I showing up? How am I making change? How am I contributing to the future I want to see? This is not about charity. This is strategy. And it begins with the mind. Welcome to Overnight Wisdom with DJ Bwakali. Hi, DJ. Welcome. Thanks for being here with me.
Thanks a lot, Chisom. It is great to be here with you, and I look forward to an awesome conversation.
Likewise. So I want to jump right into it. How did you become the DJ that the world knows?
That's a great question, a great one to start with. I really believe that the story of Africa is intertwined into every single African in the motherland and in the diaspora. And in my own case, just growing up and beginning to understand that we've got a lot of challenges here in Africa, watching how a lot of people were trying to get out of Africa, go to the US or to Europe for studies, but also just for economic opportunities. That's the time the seed was planted in me that I need to do as much as I can to ensure that the African dream is realized right here in Africa, so that when Africans travel, it is purely not for survival, just for pleasure and for curiosity. Because after all, I'm also a strong believer that Africans should not be prevented from traveling. I think this whole visa arrangement, particularly in the West, is totally unacceptable, and we should not continue accepting it as normal. Later on, I'll get into why that is very, very important, even from a human rights perspective, for every human being to be able to travel to wherever. So in a nutshell, I just from an early age became really committed to realizing the African dream right here in Africa.
I really love that. And you've done this also by journalism and writing and advocacy as well as leadership. Did you always know that this was your path?
Yeah. First of all, advocacy. Why that has played a critical role is I, from my early 20s, was really, really committed after I finished high school towards advocacy, towards ensuring that certain issues are really highlighted, especially tackling poverty, because sometimes I felt, and I still do, that the world has a very complicated relationship with poverty. And here in Africa, it is a very toxic relationship where, on the one hand, sometimes we romanticize poverty as a precursor of more intense religious or spiritual experiences. Sometimes we use it to then really convince ourselves that today may be really difficult, but tomorrow in heaven will be better. My initial advocacy was really focused on tackling poverty from its roots. And that is why I became acquainted with the works of Dr. Walter Rodney and studied how Europe underdeveloped Africa, not for purposes of being a crybaby, because what is done, but for purposes of placing this poverty into context. And then what happened is that there was a metamorphosis where, having understood the role that both Europe and the US, and nowadays also the East, China, and even Russia to an extent, I increasingly became involved in facing the bull head on. I co founded the Africa Youth Initiative on Climate Change, which is still in existence. The whole goal at that time, at about 2006, 2007, was to ensure that the young people of Africa are not on the margins of the climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation, because that has completely affected agriculture in Africa, Chisom. So I became fed up with just constantly saying that we need XYZ policies, XYZ legislation to tackle something like climate change, because I began to realize that the time and resources that it takes just to enact a good policy and to implement this policy at a very incremental pace, at a snail pace, I realize I've got to throw my hat in the ring. I've got to now not just wait for the legislators, for the United Nations and international bodies to take action, because I felt that is disempowering myself. So that's the point that I was like, what can I do on my own? And the answer was, beyond founding this regional youth movement, I also co-founded the Africa Youth Trust, another organization that was now specifically focused on governance issues. It has since broadened its mandate. But why at that time we were looking only at governance issues was because we realized if you're going to lobby for transformative policies, you might as well lobby for holistic transformative governance and work towards electing leaders who will already have it in them to enact good policies without being lobbied to do so. So it is still a journey that is unfolding, but at the moment, what I have really found myself focusing on is, and that's where the writing and the journalism comes in, to tell a three-dimensional narrative of Africa that doesn't gloss over the challenges that we face or the problems that we face, but also doesn't cover or doesn't diminish our immense, I call it the African superpower, our African resilience, because of the world's minerals, 30% are right in Africa, and 40% of the world's gold is right in Africa. 90% of the world's platinum is right in Africa. So the more we talk about that, we begin to do what I call decolonizing our education, because education is not confined to the formal walls of institutions of higher learning. And the more we decolonize our education by really coming to terms with our African superpower, then my hope and my prayer is that we will then build a critical mass of Africans who can now act from a point of knowledge that we are not just saying America messed us up, Europe messed us up. We are saying this is how we want the game to be played. Then we cease being pawns on that geopolitical chessboard. We become the grand masters on that chessboard, so to speak.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. It's something I've been grappling with a lot lately. And I think there's always been this idea that Europe will save us or the US will save us. I think perhaps this is where you talk about leadership. So when you talk about self-sustaining leadership or a leadership that has a sense of vision, I mean, you've been doing this for a while now. How do you think we're doing? How's it going?
Oh, poorly, really, really poorly. And there are two sides of that coin. The first side is that a country's leadership is a reflection of a country's people, a country's electorate. Yes, I know that a lot of times elections are quite flawed and they're not often reflecting the true will of the people. But having said that, I also know, and history, backs me up on this. When the people know that sovereign power is vested in them, there can be no leadership obstacle when our people are fully empowered and endowed, not just with that knowledge, but with that conviction that sovereign power is vested in our hands. So the first side of the coin is to call the spade a spade, like we've just done, and say that if you're trying to grade leadership in Africa today, you'd actually have to I would give it an F for failure, not even an E, but an F for failure. And this cuts across the board. It cuts across the board. Now, that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that, in a sense, it is we, the African people ourselves, who have, whether directly or indirectly, allowed that to happen by normalizing bad governance, which is why in a country like Kenya, where last year the so-called Gen Z revolution that brought out young people to the streets for the first time in Kenya's history to lead a people's revolt, an uprising against a bad law, the Kenya Finance Bill at the time, was very punitive in terms of high taxes. Now, ordinarily, what used to happen is that whenever there were such punitive laws, people would just fold their arms, rest back in their armchairs, and leave it to the politicians or the politically active. But there was that realization, mostly from the youth, that, wait a minute, we're the ones with the power. And because of those demonstrations, the president couldn't assent to that particular finance bill. And I share that anecdote to prove that point, that the other side of the coin of bad governance is in Africa is the fact that Africans themselves have, in a sense, allowed that bad governance to grow roots and to flourish, which again is the other reason why I'm really committed towards, the African awakening. I have a show on YouTube called African Awakening, whose entire goal is for Africans to awaken and realize that at the end of the day, the buck stops with us and not with our presidents.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'll be sure to link that show because I've seen some of it and it's really, really good. So thank you for the work you do.
Thanks. Thanks a lot.
DJ, you often talk about yourself as a pan-Africanist. So I want to ask you, what does that mean to you, one? And second, what does that identity demand of you?
Great. So just 2 days ago, I was talking to my father, who is now in his early 80s. I was telling him, because incidentally, he asked me the same question. He's a big fan of the work that I do and the Pan-Africanism. So he asked me, why do I normally introduce myself as an African currently living in Kenya? I told my father that his great-great-grandfather didn't know that there was a country called Nigeria. He may have known that there are people called Yoruba or Igbo, but the country Nigeria was not even existing like we know it, because that English journalist who gave Nigeria its name wasn't even born. The British hadn't even come to the Western Africa region. You see, my father's great-great-grandfather was just Pan-African, not because he chose that label. It was just the truth that he was born in, that he was an African living in the eastern part of Africa, but without those set in the stone concrete borders. And then fast forward 1880s, and you have the Berlin Conference that then sets the stage for these boundaries that we know today. Now, I'm realistic enough to appreciate the fact that if you've had more than a century of these boundaries, there's nothing particularly wrong in us continuing to have them, because you can't just wake up tomorrow and you say, now Kenya ceases to exist, Nigeria ceases to exist. But what we can do is to increasingly make those borders irrelevant. For example, last week, Kenya made it official that every single African can now travel to Kenya without a visa. You literally just hop onto the plane and show up in Nairobi or in Mombasa, the second largest city. Now, if we have that across the board in Africa, if we then make it a lot easier for our goods and products to travel across Africa, then you see what's going to happen is that we truly will be making these borders irrelevant. We will continue having country-specific passports, at least for the foreseeable future. But it's just not going to make sense. If I can travel to Zambia tomorrow without complicated and bureaucratic work permits and what have you, then there's going to be an equilibrium where the center, like Chinua Achebe once talked of, the center will just hold with time, because people will move around. And the more that happens, the more people will realize that all of us are Pan-Africanists. We were just not conscious about it. The reason I am conscious about my Pan-Africanism is that realization from a very young age that I've got to work towards realizing the African dream. And then there are when I was able to travel a lot across Africa, and I am meeting people who, if I tell somebody that this is my brother, they would believe it because these people look like me. The accent may be a bit different, but everything else is the same. Then I went to Dakar because I was part of a movement known as Independent Media Network. That again, I co-founded that in the East African region. So we were in Dakar, and I remember like yesterday how I went to the streets of Dakar and tried to talk to the Senegalese there. And I was completely lost, because I don't speak Wolof. At the time, I didn't speak French. We totally could not communicate. And at that point in the streets of Dakar, I was like, we've really been messed up and we have to get out of this. Because if I can't even speak to my brothers and sisters in Dakar, in Senegal, and they constitute half of Africa, the so-called Francophone, they speak French. And it drove home the point that I have to intentionally, consciously, and strategically work like crazy towards a Pan-Africanism that I call transformative Pan-Africanism. It's not just a romanticized feeling that one love, one Africa, but in reality, it is not one Africa. Those are some of the experiences that informed the fact that I had to now start being solution oriented by initially and constantly focusing on decolonizing our education, decolonizing our minds. One of the practical things that I then did was I was like, I'm going to start selling certain products to the southern part of Africa so that I'm not just saying that we need to trade, that goods need to move freely, but I want to experience that, both from a business standpoint, but also from a Pan-African standpoint. So I began selling Maasai sandals because they're unique to Kenya. They were well received in the Southern Africa region, South Africa, Botswana, Zambia. But then I realized, oops, I can't transport them by air because then people will not be able to afford them. Transferring stuff by air is still astronomical here in Africa. So I discovered that I could do that using trucks. Like there were people, ingenious Africans, who had come up with this system where trucks leave Nairobi, then go all the way to Johannesburg, and all the countries that these trucks pass, they can deliver parcels. So that became a lot cheaper, but I also experienced the challenges of doing that. So something like that is something that I still want to double down on so that those agbadas in Nigeria, because they are not in Eastern Africa or Southern Africa, I have a feeling that if they are easily available, lots of folks will be able to buy them. All that value chain, is going to benefit. So we've got to have a lot more of that business, mingling that with the sentimental Pan-Africanism, if you will, so that it's not just saying, let's do this, but also trying to find different avenues of doing it.
As a way to also kind of like participate in the economic collaboration / co-creation as well, I guess.
Exactly.
When you were talking about not being able to speak with someone who spoke Wolof, we know a lot of, even before, let's say, colonialism, a lot of different ethnic groups spoke different languages. So when we're looking at decolonization, what language do we adopt? How do we find a way to communicate across borders? Is that something you've thought about?
Absolutely, absolutely. There are two answers I can share about that are very concrete. The first one, Chisom, is this. You see, indulge me for a minute and imagine that there was no colonization in Africa. The British didn't come, the French didn't come, or they came and then we conquered them. Now, what would have happened in all likelihood is the same thing that led to the birth of Swahili. Swahili is the most widely spoken language across many countries because it's all over Eastern Africa, parts of Central, DRC Congo to be specific. And Swahili was born because of that need to trade by our forefathers like 200 years or so ago. Our forefathers, mostly the Bantu speakers, when they were trading with the Arabs and with each other, because there was no common language, no English, no French, no Portuguese, they began mixing different Bantu words and sprinklings of Arabic words, which is why to date, there's a minute percentage of Swahili that is exactly the same as Arab, but it is mostly, overwhelmingly, a mixture of Bantu words. Now, if that colonization had not taken place, my suspicion is that the same thing would have happened at a regional level, that either Swahili would now have had sprinklings of Fulani, Igbo, Ewe from Ghana and Burkina Faso. But now that that didn't happen, we cannot turn back the hand of time to see how things turn out. But what we can do is to very intentionally begin to teach some of these major African languages across the board, so that if more people speak Yoruba than Fulani, for example, then maybe we can have 5 or so dominant languages in West Africa to be taught in Eastern Africa, but make it fun, so that it's not like a boring obligation where kids start feeling like, why do I have to learn Swahili? If we make it fun and if we anchor that into patriotism and Pan-Africanism, if we then attach it to a sort of reward scheme. For example, the reason I then learned French was because I wanted to be able to speak to people in Senegal next time I'm there. There was that inner motivation, and I didn't feel compelled. It was more like, I want to learn French because there's a clear reward that at the end, I will be able to speak to millions more Africans. So at a legislative level, whether led by the African Union or even bilaterally, for example, Nigeria and Senegal bilaterally could just agree that maybe we can begin teaching Wolof in Nigeria and vice versa. And also the French, we cannot run away from the fact that French and English are now the most dominant languages in Africa. So we don't have to run away from them. We can simply leverage them so that Africans who are in the English-speaking parts of the continent should increasingly learn French as they learn African languages. And then those in Francophone Africa should increasingly learn English as they learn Swahili and Zulu. I think practically that has to be done. We cannot wish it away. We have to tackle at that linguistic level and then at a cultural level. But it starts with that linguistic level. Then the traveling, we need to make it as easy and as affordable as possible for Africans to travel within Africa.
Absolutely. And I also think from a travel perspective, it's easier to get to Europe than to get to some countries in Africa from Africa, which is ridiculous.
Yeah. And you see something like that, again, we no longer have the luxury of just putting it on the doorstep of our presidents and saying that John Mahama of Ghana, it's not cheap to travel from Ghana to Nairobi, Accra to Nairobi, because John Mahama is a bad guy. It is up to us Africans to make what you've just said an electoral issue, so that anybody running for president in any African country has to answer, what policies do you propose to put in place to make traveling across Africa a lot cheaper, like at least half as cheap? Because unless Africans make it an electoral issue, there will never be pressure, and without labor pains, there is no birth.
Right.
Yeah.
I hear you and I completely agree that they should be matters that we vote on. But I'm also mindful that oftentimes leaders, politicians promise heaven and earth. And when they get into office, they do the exact opposite of what they are supposed to do. So how do we hold them accountable in a situation where, we put it on the ballot, we voted, they said the right things, and then they get in office? In a lot of cases, at least for 4 years. How do we hold them accountable?
You see, the reason they don't keep their promises is because they're the ones who come with their manifestos and tell us that I'm going to do A, B, C, D, X, Y, Z.
Right.
But we have to turn that coin completely. Servant leadership means that I am the boss, you're the boss. So it should stop being about them telling us what they will do, but us telling them what we want them to do. Because then it becomes a directive from the people who hold sovereign power that we are demanding XYZ from you guys. Actually, I've been agitating a lot in my social media, in my book and my writings, that we really, really need to wake up to the fact that once we know exactly what we want as at a national level, at a sub-regional level, and at a continental level, then one concrete thing we can start doing is to turn referendums into a tool of communicating what the people want. And one of the things I've been agitating a lot about is this issue of a single African currency. Tanzania has elections later this year. So imagine if Tanzanians vote on, do they want a single African currency or not? Just yes and no.
Mm,
And
mm,
then embed that into the electoral process so that Tanzania is not going to spend an extra coin for that referendum. It's just going to be part of voting for the president. Now, 90%, 80%, a big majority of Tanzanians actually vote that they want a single African currency. It will have a lot more weight than now. Now it is still largely academic. You know,
right.
it's just people like me and those who are avid Pan-Africanists who are talking about such stuff. But if it is on the ballot, then there will have to be a debate where some
Right.
politicians, nationalist politicians, will be saying, no, 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 we cannot give up the Tanzanian shilling. And they
Hmm.
have to give their reasons. So in short, it will become a national conversation.
Right.
And once it's a national conversation, if it is voted yes, then it is the voice of the people giving a directive to the Tanzanian president that we are now demanding from you that you need to work towards a single African currency. So I feel very strongly that one concrete thing that Africa has to start doing that it is currently not doing is to ask the question, how can the electorate truly become the masters, truly become the boss,
Right.
issuing directives and orders to the leaders that this is what we want, because the people never say what they want. It is these leaders who just say, I'm going to build this road, I'm going to do this and this. And a
Right.
lot of those things they say they will do, they should be doing anyway. It should not even be an issue. You know, it's like you're telling people who depend on you that tomorrow I will make lunch. It's a given that you should make lunch. Uh, it's just a given.
Right. Right, right. Absolutely. Okay, I like that framing. And so that brings me to thinking about if we look at Africa as a whole, there's an entire movement happening around what does decolonization look like? What does re-indigenization also look like? And on one hand, we're grappling with the leftovers, the remnants of
Yeah,
colonialism. And in many ways, a lot of us are still operating under coloniality. So I'm
yeah,
thinking, because we have this binary where on one hand we have a contested history collectively as a continent,
yeah,
and then there's also this celebration of potential of all Africa can be, even though it currently isn't. As someone who operates between that tension, how do you navigate it? And what do you think is most urgent? There are a lot of things that are urgent. But if
yeah,
you could pick one thing that is most urgent that we need to collectively reframe to be able to
yeah.
get where we need to get, what would you say it is?
It would actually be food sovereignty because food is a basic human need, and all of us agree that it's not a luxury. You either eat or you die. It's that simple. Yeah.
Yes.
So if we begin really, really spotlighting the fact that there's empirical evidence that every single minute an African dies from cancer, and
Yeah.
one major reason that happens is food, our nutrition. Even when we take vegetables, for instance, because they're healthy, a lot of times these vegetables are tinged with toxic fertilizers. Toxic fertilizers that ended up in Africa because we totally forgot that there's something called organic farming,
Mm,
and we were told that if you want 1 acre to give you thrice as much, then it's better to use chemical fertilizer as opposed to organic manure. So if we're spotlighting food sovereignty, it means we have to answer a number of questions, including how do we produce this food? And why in heaven's name are there still Africans who are starving? Yet 60% of the world's remaining arable land is right here in Africa.
mm,
What's missing in that equation? How can Africa produce so much food that there's surplus to be exported? And how can that value chain be inclusive of the smallholders who largely feed Africa? Now, at that level, we would then address the tension of that large industrial farm produces a critical mass that makes it cheaper, more profitable. But the issue is more profitable for how many more people, you know? So can we have a hybrid solution where these smallholders are helped to have organic manure or organic fertilizers so that more money goes to these smallholders across Africa, but at the same time, Africans eat healthier food? Then that will force us to address issues like wheat. The three grains that are most widely consumed in Africa are rice, wheat, and maize. Now, none of those is indigenous to Africa. What is indigenous to Africa is stuff like millet, sorghum, Talking about food sovereignty will force us to have to also answer the question, what is the food that we've actually lost? Can we recapture that food? Yeah, but we will be doing that not just from an intellectual curiosity standpoint, because then you lose out on most people, but yeah, from a survival standpoint, from a flourish standpoint, from a sovereignty standpoint. And the one word system that is really reverberating across Africa now is sovereignty. It is a singular reason. Well, there are several, but it is one of the main reasons Ibrahim Traore is wildly popular across Africa and the world, especially with the young people, because they are now resonating with this focus on sovereignty. So if you talk about food sovereignty, and then if we can make structural changes, if we can embed a lot more sovereignty in these food systems of Africa, that will actually have a domino effect on other sectors.
I understand and I see the need for a leader like Traore, because I think both the Africans on the continent and Africans in the diaspora were just tired. We're tired of leaders that continue to pander to Western powers, to Western ideologies.
Yeah.
And it doesn't benefit us. We show up, we pander, and then nothing happens. They extract, and the people in Africa and the African child are left with next to nothing. I'm trying to get to know his work and his politics. But it's really just refreshing to see a leader who's like, we're done, And I think that is what Africa needs.
Exactly. It's precisely what we need. The reason I've even dug a lot deeper into Traore and tried to show the concrete gains in Burkina Faso is I knew that there was that danger that the West has been so good in building caricatures that then end up sticking. So I realized that it was feasible that 5 years from now, this short-term history, that caricature of Traore would begin setting in. And when we mythologize him, unfortunately, it can fade into a caricature. But if we go beyond the myth and realize that there's actually a lot of substance in his leadership, there are electric vehicles being produced today, while it's mostly assembling. But Burkina Faso is doing a lot more than other African countries in terms of assembling these electric vehicles. Burkina Faso is really, really working on this issue of food sovereignty. So I agree with you that Africa was and remains hungry for a Traore.
Yes.
I did a video titled Africa Needs 54 Traores. In your own country here in Africa, as you celebrate Traore, draw inspiration from him to either elect your own Traore in your country or be the Traore. After all, he's very young. So there's no excuse that, I'm only 35. Because even Patrice Lumumba before him was only 34. Thomas Sankara before him was only 34. So Africa's youth no longer have an excuse. They just have to step up.
Yeah, absolutely. I also see what you say about food sovereignty quite important because I often think about this African child who all these NGOs in the world have used to collect billions since the beginning of time, where the image of Africa is always this hungry child, deeply malnourished, and we're waiting for the white man to come save us.
Yeah.
And I think there's something inherent there in terms of how are we dealing and creating and building our own food systems. Lately, I've also been speaking up a bit more around the need for Africa to rise, the
Yeah.
need for us to decolonize our minds. And of
Yeah.
course, a lot of people say, oh, why don't we just forget? Come on, colonialism happened,
Yeah.
way
Yeah.
back when.
Yeah.
And of course, we have to move forward, but there's something about knowing where you come from and who
Yeah.
you were before you were
Yeah.
colonized. So, my question for you is,
Yeah.
in a continent where we see historical injustices that
Yeah.
remain unaddressed or even remembered in fragments, what role does writing, advocacy, and the
Yeah.
work that you do
Yeah.
play? And is it meant or is it important that we disrupt
Yeah.
it, or does
Yeah.
it just lead us to being
Yeah.
re-traumatized?
Yeah. Yeah, great, great, great question. Because I truly believe, that maxim that the pen is mightier than the sword
Mm.
is so, so, so true. Because you just have to look at the two major religions in the world today, Christianity and Islam. They are all rooted in writings. In the
Yes.
case of Christianity, it would be the Old Testament and the New Testament. Unless that was captured and written, I dare say Christianity would not be as successful as it is today. Same thing to Islam, where
Mm-hmm.
the Holy Quran also, written. Yes, in both cases, the adherents believe that it was inspired writing, but it is still writing nonetheless.
Mm.
So in today's Africa, one of the things that has to happen at the primary school level is African history in its pure form must be taught from grade 1 or primary 1 onwards. And there must be a complete overhaul of the curricula across Africa. Chisholm, if the great female warriors of in Benin, if that
Mm.
was taught across Africa, imagine the self-esteem, the sense of power that 9-year-old African girl in grade 2 or grade 3 will have, knowing and learning in school that about 200 years ago, there was this all-female army that was also all-conquering, teaching that unadulterated, pure African history. And we must now have a continental effort. Multiple hundreds, if not thousands of Africans must participate in building on the existing works of knowledge that are there, so that at the end of the day, it becomes this all-consuming Pan-African feeling that now we are capturing our real history so that we can decolonize our education. Because if we just say decolonize our education without that pervasive effort, then it remains sort of an empty hollow shell.
I
Yeah.
love that. I'm thinking about the importance of remembering who we were before they told us who we should be. I know for myself, when I started learning about the women warriors, for me, it was like, whoa, mind
Yes.
blowing. But I didn't get
Yes.
to this knowledge, I think, until I was 14, 15, because I was an avid reader, but it wasn't taught
Uh-huh.
in school.
Uh-huh.
And there are a lot of people who only found out about this within an African context because of the
Exactly.
movie that came out, The Woman King. And
Yeah, yeah.
it's empowering knowing your history, knowing where you come from. And then it's
Exactly.
also our responsibility, though, to teach those histories, to create that sense
Exactly.
of pride. Because I think,
Exactly.
unfortunately, for a lot of the African leaders, presidents that we have
Yes.
currently, I don't think they carry a sense of pride in their country, in their land,
Absolutely.
in their people.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, it's very true, which is why the role you're playing, you see, like this podcast, alone is something very concrete that in its own way is contributing towards that decolonization. And one of the things that has to happen is somebody like yourself, because you speak with a lot of empathy and you listen with a lot of empathy. And that is something most people don't have. So if that gift is leveraged in this effort, so that even as we work on the curriculum in the schools to reflect what we're discussing, if people like you and I also step up our game a lot more to dive into the deep end of decolonizing our education, decolonizing our minds, then one thing is going to lead to another, and we will be able to either complement what will start happening in the schools or to accelerate what should start
Mm.
happening there. Because imagine if, like, 20 girls from Kenya and Nigeria have a fireside chat with you, and you share, you echo this conversation. But from your experience, what's going to happen is that in their psyche, they begin to draw a linkage between those all-female army, but also their big sister Chisom, who values them and celebrates them. And then there'll be that symbiotic relationship, between us and them. So we really have to keep thinking. We really have to keep rolling up our sleeves and multitask so that on the one hand, we are calling for our education system to be completely overhauled. And then on the other hand, we're also stepping up what we are doing.
I like to think about it as a flywheel. We all have to tend our own parts. We have to do it simultaneously. I have a question. In
Yes.
Africa,
Yes.
in what ways do you believe that we are free? And in what ways do you think we're still in captive?
Yeah. That's a really powerful one, because that first part sometimes is not focused on enough. In what ways do I believe we are free? The one major way that I believe we are still free is our relationship with nature. The one thing that is used to diss Africa, the fact that rural Africa is still where most Africans still live, actually for me is one of our biggest strengths, that people in rural Africa and many Africans like myself who are based in urban centers still have homes in the rural parts. So because our relationship with our rural homes is very intact, one of the consequences of that is that my relationship, for instance, with land is definitely very different than the relationship somebody who born and bred in New York has with land, because for me, land flows in my veins, literally. So at a broader level, that speaks to our relationship with nature. And I think it's not by accident that Wangari Maathai became the first Nobel recipient, was also an environmentalist, and that her environmental work contributed greatly to her winning that Nobel Prize, because her relationship with nature simply mirrored the relationship that many women have with nature, many African women. Unfortunately, that freedom, because of poverty, sometimes becomes viewed as bondage. For example, when a woman has to walk for 20 kilometers to get water and 5 kilometers in search of firewood, she's not going to be exactly hallelujah, hosanna with the firewood, because it reflects a lot of pain on her part. I dare say even trauma. But if, for example, she's able to access energy saving fuel for cooking, the freedom will rush back in. Many of these people in the rural areas, even in the urban areas, would be able to tell you that this particular tree, if you use the bark of the tree, it can stem bleeding. Things like those at varying levels of expertise. But our relationship with nature is not something that we learn in schools. Then there was a second part of your question.
The second part was, in what ways are we still captive?
Okay. I would use Bob Marley's song of Emancipate Yourself from Mental Slavery, because, yeah, that is the one area we're totally captive, like totally. And our presidents are the best example for that. I truly, 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 wholeheartedly empathize with the family of the late Buhari. I will never bring politics into somebody's father or parent or sister or friend losing their life. And I start with that disclaimer, so that in the likely or unlikely event they ever watch this, I am not using that to just stomp on your grief, because nobody should do that. Yeah. Now, I only mention that because when it passed on in the UK, again, it was a reminder that even for our presidents and the elite in the African society, they have zero faith in the medical institutions in Africa, despite the fact that when you're president, you're charged with the responsibility of bringing that quality healthcare in London to Abuja. That's your responsibility, and that's a matter of life and death. And the fact that you then don't do that, squarely blame it on mental slavery, because you are not free in your mind you're still living as a slave in your mind, and you perennially just look at London as the place that has to continue treating you and your family, despite the fact that there are more than 200 million Nigerians who can't all troop to London for that treatment. Yeah. So that actually equals at all levels of society, all levels of society. Most of us are guilty, whether consciously or subconsciously, of that mental slavery. There we're still captive, and the antidote to that is exactly what is happening at this moment. Because I'm 100% sure that, inshallah, there are fellow Africans out there, whether it will be next month or next year or even next decade, will catch snippets of this conversation or the entire conversation. And just like that, and you and I will never even know about it, in the privacy of wherever they'll be watching this, they will begin to have that emancipation. So on that particular issue of mental slavery, we have to work on that because it's a big scourge and stain on us.
Absolutely. And we have to start believing that we are enough, you know? And I think there's that mental slavery where we don't invest in ourselves. We don't think we are quality, but we are.
Absolutely. We are. We are enough, more than enough. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So a question for you. You have a public profile. Your platforms digitally must come with some level of scrutiny. How do you navigate that?
On the one hand, there's a lot of expectation. Like when people tell you you're the Malcolm X of Africa, you know, you are the so and so, present day Lumumba, it feels good, but it also comes with an appreciation. Exactly, the responsibility and the fact that there's such hunger chisum in Africa for transformative leadership at whatever level, not just politically. There's such hunger for that. And it's something that we still have to tap into because people like Martin Luther King Jr., he was not an elected official. He was in Ghana when Ghana gained independence. Him and Malcolm X were really keen on Africa's own journey. But I mentioned him to again remind all of us that you don't have to be president to then make a difference. Thomas Sankara, one of the greatest leaders ever, didn't win nothing by the ballot. You know, I'm not championing for coup d'etats on your platform, but just to remind people.
Hey, let's do it. Let's do it. At this rate, let's do it.
Just so I don't want them to come for you there. Yeah, but just to remind people that this was just a 34-year-old soldier. And he started being active in political leadership at 30, 31. He was doing all that not because he was elected into political office, but because he had this burning passion to change Africa, to transform Africa, starting with Burkina Faso. So once we understand that, then if one feels that you don't have a political calling, just realizing that at your own level, you know, back to your question, I now know that at my own level, there's so much I can do to ensure that I play the role I'm supposed to play to actually transform Africa. And the decolonizing of fellow Africans' minds as I continue decolonizing my own. But at the same time, there's still more ways I can leverage this public profile. For example, I am currently the grassroots mobilizing coordinator of one of the leading presidential candidates in Kenya, a guy called Senator Okiya Mtata, who is looking towards running for president in 2027. So you see, I'm able to do that because I'm leveraging this public profile. Even him, he only knew me because of this. We didn't know each other before. But this was enough to convince him. Maybe there's a role I can play to mobilize the grassroots in Kenya to believe in transformative leadership. So there's still more stuff that I'm looking towards continually using this profile. I would say the biggest of them all would be my books because the one that is out there currently, Savannah Footprints. The whole motivation for that was the subtitle of that book is Wisdom Whispers from Historic African Leaders. So through that book, I've been able to show Africans that, guys, this is Thomas Sankara. This is what today's Africa should learn from him. Guys, this is Patrice Lumumba. This is the outrage that was visited on him. This is what we can learn from him. The one that I'm now working on currently, that should be read in the next 2 months or so, now answers the question, what are some of the things we can do concretely to actually transform Africa? And there's a whole chapter there on this issue of single African currency, another chapter on food sovereignty. So depending on somebody's convictions and persuasions, they can even just pick one chapter there and say, okay, I'm going to run with food sovereignty. So a lot of that is rooted in this public profile. Without it, you wouldn't know about me. We wouldn't be talking. So there's a way of now really leveraging this so that there's optimal impact, if you will.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll be sure to check out your books and also link them, including the new one when it comes out, because I think a lot of people should definitely hear you and your work. What you were sharing about how do we make change where we are, right? I find myself increasingly frustrated about that government or that leader not doing what you're supposed to do. And as much as I retain my right to constructively criticize them, I've also been grappling with what can I do in the space that I have? And this is why I've started actively speaking up, writing, because I'm good at writing. How do I use my words? How do I use my voice to change something? So I guess I want to echo what you're saying. For whoever is listening, what can you change in the sphere where you have influence? Maybe you don't want to be a governor, a politician, or a president.
Exactly.
But within your own sphere of influence, you can do something. I mean, so that's kind of what I feel. So that resonated because for me, I'm there where I'm tired of seeing the same thing happen all over again.
A point I can drive home there, because for those watching us or listening to us who are students and have this feeling that once I'm done with my studies, then whichever space I'll be in, I can, do something. You've got to realize that you just need to look at Steve Biko, the leader and founder of the Black Consciousness Movement in South Africa. Everything Steve Biko achieved, he achieved it as a student. Before they killed him in prison, he founded the Black Consciousness as a student. He wrote so much and made so many arguments that still stand to date. You as a student, in fact, you're in a much better place to help Africa dream of where it should be, because you've not yet reached a place where you're giving up on stuff. You're still idealistic, so to speak. And Africa needs your idealism. So whichever field you're in, you can answer the question, what little things can I start doing? What powerful seeds can I start planting? Look at Burkina Faso. It's just this small landlocked country in the middle of the Sahel, a crazy desert, man. But look at what Burkina Faso, the impact that it is having on Africa now. Every single African country also has a big responsibility and can impact Africa in amazing ways, but only if those students, doctors, and employed youth from that country reach a place where they are saying, Tosha. Tosha is a Swahili word that means enough is enough. I will not continue living like this. And the best I can do is to just keep hoping that we have a good president. Nah, I'm not going to be part of that no more.
What have you learned about power? How it's held, how it's shared, and how it's reclaimed?
I've learned that when power is misused, it destroys completely. The best example is the solar energy. All this sunshine in Africa continues playing a role in desertification, but we can't blame the power of the sun, because when you channel that power of the sun, you have energy. And solar energy is now the most promising energy globally. So for me, that speaks to how power should be used. We've got to capture this power, and most importantly, channel it for the good of the people.
Okay. What have you had to unlearn or relearn in order to become the man you are today?
What I really had to unlearn is my mental slavery. Certain things that I thought were good for me were in fact perpetuating my mental slavery. For instance, this issue of food sovereignty, my own eating habits, like many Africans, were completely either ignorant or indifferent to the fact that constantly messing up my health. So I've had to unlearn my culinary habits, and I've had to learn how can my culinary habits both inject more health into my body, but also into my mind.
I love that. Okay. What are you still becoming?
I'm still becoming somebody who is spiritually rooted because if you look at ancient Africa, even today, in today's Africa, the older folks, 80 years and above, you find that many of them have a spirituality that is not religious, that just makes them better people, helps them to live more wholesome lives. So I'm still learning and I'm still becoming a more spiritual being.
I love that. That's deep. Okay. What are you aspiring to in your personal life?
I am just aspiring to continually nurture kindness within me because the challenge of this public profile is that the more you are known, the more you're celebrated and appreciated, the more your ego can become inflated. And that has an adverse effect on your kindness because ego is about a big head, not a big heart. So yeah, just nurturing a bigger and a bigger heart.
I love that. What are you aspiring to in your professional life?
My books are going to be the most read in Africa's history.
Yes.
You are a writer too, so
Yes, I love it.
may your books. Do you want to write books? Are you writing books
Yes,
also?
I am
Okay,
writing a book at the moment.
perfect, perfect. Then our books have to be read across, not for purposes of pumping our egos, but rather, if my books are being read by 1 million Africans every day, imagine the level of decolonization that is going on. So I just want to keep working on that, to cough up. Kwame Nkrumah wrote at least 13 books, and those books continue to have a lot of resonance. Wanna keep working on the quantity and quality of my books so that this mental slavery that Africans are steeped in, we can continue breaking free from those shackles.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I manifest for you and for also everyone in the continent that we read your books, that we continue to unlearn, and that 500 years into the future that we're still
Thank
talking
you.
about, what we learned from DJ. So,
Thank you.
and a final question I have for you, DJ, is
Yes.
if you could speak to the young person you once were, what would you want them to know? And who do you hope they become for the future ahead?
If I could speak to the me 25 years ago in my early 20s, I would echo one thing, that you need to know that there's just an African superpower within you that lives there. So just keep nurturing it. And the more you do that, the more you'll keep realizing your dreams, the more you'll enjoy the becoming. It will not just be about the end result. It will also be about the journey that you're going through. And it's going to be so fulfilling, so wholesome, because it's not just about transforming Africa, it's about transforming yourself. And it starts there. And you have to be what I call a joyful warrior. You've got to have fun and really enjoy it as you do it. Yeah.
I love that. Okay, that's really great. This has been wonderful. Thanks for just the endless nuggets of wisdom. I really appreciate it.
You're most welcome, and thank you for the platform. It was an honor being here, especially because, as I said earlier, you're a very active, empathetic listener. And thanks too for your very witty nuggets of wisdom.
Thank you. Thank you. This is lovely. Thanks a lot. Thank you for spending time with us on Overnight Wisdom. If this conversation moved you, inspired you, or made you pause, please leave a comment, or share it with someone who needs to hear it. You can follow the show wherever you get your podcasts And if you're feeling generous, a rating or review goes a long way in helping others find us too. Until next time, stay curious, stay tender, and may the wisdom you need find you exactly when you're ready.